Well, then you'll allow me to introduce our next speaker, who also is a member of the B2 Collective and someone who has joined us within the period when we've been actively, consciously trying to introduce into our thinking topics which weren't there, but topics which are treated in ways that are continuous with our own deep critical impulses. So let me introduce to you David Golumbia, who comes today from Virginia Commonwealth. Excuse me. Forgive me, sorry. David is a person who, if you've ever been on Twitter or something, you know, is very active in social media and is consequently, this is one of the reasons he's deeply active in social media, is a deep thinker about the problems of technology and digital culture and digital media. So his talk today will be continuous with some of the things that arose as topics around Tony's responses and other people's concerns about what happens to the digitalization of a population. I know that David is writing a new book, and perhaps we'll get him to talk to us about it, but his two existing books, one from Harvard is called The Cultural Logic of Computation, and the second, more recent, possibly even more controversial, because it engages with the right-wing powers where they intersect very strongly with the technocracy of the US money markets and the US state. His most recent book is called The Politics of Bitcoin, with a subtitle that tells you everything you need to know, that software as right-wing extremism. Continuing that line of thought, today David's topic is cyberlibertarianism, a term I've heard him use as an awful accusation directed at people. But before we go, if you don't mind, let me just say one other thing, which I think I want to be sure not to lose track of in this introduction. I mentioned that David, with Arne earlier, had been working extremely hard to make B2O a viable and important part of the Boundary 2 project, and I can't thank them enough for it and for their fatigue with it at times. But you should take a look there and to see very recently a special issue, as it were, a special project that David has curated and brought to bear as a B2O special issue on what he calls the digital turn, which contains a number of very important essays that I think must be read to get a full grasp of many of the things that we've been talking about here already today. So please welcome David Golumbia.
Thanks, Paul, and it's nice to see everyone. I'm sorry I've been wearing a mask all along. I felt like I should, and some people I know in Richmond have gotten COVID lately, and I'm probably just being extra cautious. I'm so grateful to be here, and grateful to Don for his hospitality, and especially to Paul for so many, many things over the years. And mentorship and friendship and encouragement of this kind of work, and to be part of this collective and this project has been really amazing. I told Paul I couldn't speak at this conference because I have to work on my book, and he said, well, just read from your book then. So that is what I'm going to do. This actually is my next book. I think the title is Cyberlibertarianism, the Right-Wing Foundations of Digital Politics. I'm still fudging with that. And this will probably be a little bit kludged together, but I will do my best. And I have to say, as Paul said there, I'm really pleased with, there's a lot of continuity with themes that other people have brought up, all the talks I've seen actually, and it hopefully might be kind of interesting. I think you'll see what I mean when I get to them, but I'm gonna just try to read, so okay. So what I have here is mostly from the introductory parts of the book, where I lay out what some of the terms and ideas are, and then I have just two brief sections, one kind of a whole brief section that describes how some of these things work, and then a little longer excerpt from a section on freedom of speech, which will tie a bit into what Arnie's talking about, and also, of course, trying to find how the right uses what appear to be possibly neutral or left causes is definitely I would say the main reason that I think this work is important. It has to be done. So from free and open source software to free culture and internet freedom, from net neutrality to censorship resistance to support for unbreakable encryption and absolute anonymity, these and many other terms serve as rallying cries for digital activists from across the political spectrum, raising questions about what the terms might actually mean, let alone what might be the arguments for and against the causes they seem to represent, is simply to stand in the way of progress. To oppose free software, these advocates say, is simply to be evil. And I'm quoting there from the leading supporter of free software. Most of the time, advocates are blunt. Freedom and justice lie on the side of the cause and the term the advocates promote. To oppose them is to oppose our most cherished values. These claims should give those of us outside the hothouse of digital advocacy real pause. Granted the urgency with which digital enthusiasts tell us that projects like open source software and internet freedom are vital political causes, it is odd that there is so little detailed discussions of positions supporting and opposing them, or demonstration of the ways that they fit into the rest of our politics. It is hard, if not impossible, to find full descriptions of the various nuanced positions and their pros and cons in digital advocacy, as there is for other political issues. Instead, one finds work after work recommending just one position, or at best slight variations of that one position, often seeming as if they are copy and pasted from each other, with very little interest in articulating the underlying and fundamental questions that the topics seem to entail. When Richard Stallman, the person I was quoting above, famously says that free software means free as in free speech, not as in free beer, which is the statement he uses to just shut down debate about this topic, the statement is almost always taken to be clear and sufficient. Yet even cursory reflection will show that what the free software movement recommends has almost nothing in common with what free means in free speech. To the very limited degree that software is analogous to speech, whatever it automatically has the same protections as do other forms of speech. It is nearly impossible to find free software advocates reflecting on this or providing anything like the detailed analyses that would be required to connect freedom of speech to freedom of software, whatever that might be. The second striking fact about these topics is that while they are discussed and promoted as if they are obviously political, their relationship to standard political issues and orientations is at best opaque. While words like privacy and rights and of course free and freedom occur repeatedly in the names these issues are given, it is frequently less than clear exactly how we are to understand the way they are being used. When encryption advocates demand, for example, that governments be absolutely unable to surveil or retrospectively examine electronic communications, even with a legal warrant, because of what they call privacy, it is difficult to find any digital enthusiast reflecting at all on the fact that privacy here has to mean something different than it does in what lawyers and judges and legislators mean when they use the term. In fact, the term has rarely, if ever, in any prior democratic context, been used to mean that law enforcement and legislators should never be able to serve properly executed warrants, which is exactly how it's used in digital advocacy. It is not that encryption promoters might or might not have been offering a correct analysis, but instead that questions itself of the nature of privacy, deep political philosophical questions that have been debated in the US and every democracy for hundreds of years, get shunted aside in favor of a dogma whose function is to forestall our asking these real questions. Everyone should be in favor of absolute freedom of speech, we hear repeatedly, despite the fact that quite a few lawyers, judges, legal scholars, and democracies other than the US take a different approach to this complex question. But at least we think we understand what the principle of freedom of speech has been taken to mean. When we are told that everyone should be in favor of more or less absolute internet freedom, because it is, quote, freedom of speech for the internet, or a similar formulation, all of a sudden these deep and abiding questions fall away. Cyberlibertarianism is a term scholars and journalists have developed to try and highlight and understand this phenomenon. Despite its utility, we need to say at the outset that this term has potentially misleading connotations. Its incorporation of the word libertarian may suggest that it is meant to point at the widespread presence of overt libertarian politics in digital culture, and it does mean that to an extent. But it also points at a wider phenomenon that may not be immediately obvious from the word itself. Cyberlibertarianism may at its narrowest core be taken as a commitment to the belief that digital technology is or should be beyond the oversight of democratic governments, that is, of democratic political sovereignty. Just reminding a little bit of aesthetic exceptionalism, as Arnie was talking about it, because it is sometimes called, digital technology exceptionalism or internet exceptionalism. Frequently, the sentiment can be reduced to the view that democratic governments cannot or must not regulate the internet, or to flip this formulation on its head, that the internet should be a place to which law does not apply. Even in this narrow form, cyberlibertarianism is in many ways absurd and self-contradictory, not least visible in its alternation between the views that governments are unable to use laws to regulate digital technology and the view that governments must not be allowed to use laws to regulate it, two ideas which are in certain ways incompatible. Just skipping a little bit here. In a broader sense, so cyberlibertarianism has especially some pretty famous exponents in John Perry Barlow's 1996 Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace and a slightly less well-known 1994 Magna Carta for the Knowledge Age, which was crafted by George Gilder and Alvin Toffler, who worked closely with Newt Gingrich, all of whom were pretty right-wing figures. Gotta skip something here. Langdon Winter came up with the name cyberlibertarianism from reading this second document, Magna Carta for the Information Age. And it was kind of a political, philosophical discussion of what is happening in those documents. And the reason we need to look back at it is because as right as Winter was in 1997 when he wrote that article, and it's pretty clear that he would agree that this stuff has become much more powerful than he first noticed it, right? And the way it has become powerful is in direct day-to-day political, legislative, but also technological activism circles, and in ways that are not immediately necessarily apparent, how they connect back to these earlier formations. So in a broad sense, cyberlibertarian dogma emerges as a set of tropes and rhetorical strategies that work to close off discussion rather than to open it up. To close down inquiry rather than exposing one's presuppositions to it, and other framing activities. For those of us watching from this angle, it has been a remarkable irony that tools advertised as promoting democratization, which is one of the favorite words of the people who promote this, the accessibility of knowledge and the wide dispersal of information, can have been simultaneously conjoined to a belief system that seems designed precisely to prevent the exercise of those values. Calling cyberlibertarianism a belief system gives it too much credit. Belief system implies that there is a coherent body of doctrine available that can be articulated both in terms of the grounding of its premises and the way that its elements proceed from these premises. Cyberlibertarianism can claim no such coherence. Many of its most cherished principles directly contradict one another, even when they can be specified in adequate detail, which they often cannot. For example, the values of privacy, which might or might not be the same thing as secrecy, and openness, which might or might not be the same thing as publicity or transparency, are ones that, under various names, have long been discussed in a wide range of philosophical and political venues. It is widely acknowledged by non-digital thinkers across the political spectrum that privacy and openness can conflict with each other in important ways. Maximum privacy would seem to suggest that nothing is ever put out in the open, where maximum openness would seem to suggest that everything must be. Sober thinking about these topics recognizes that both privacy and openness are important values, that they may conflict with each other, and that it is the job of politics to carefully weigh these values and others like them in specific cases. While there certainly are cases that nearly everyone would acknowledge should be ruled almost entirely by privacy, for example, a child's medical records, but should those records be available to emergency room doctors even without the parent's consent to save the child's life, and others ruled almost entirely by publicity or openness, for example, legislative proceedings, but should that prohibit confidential discussion of diplomatic and military matters that are uncontroversially confidential matters of state? The majority of cases fall in between these absolutes. In cyber-libertarian writings about these questions, answers to them are presented as obvious, unproblematic absolutes. Everything should be maximally private, we will read from them on one day. Everything must be maximally open the next. There are no contradictions, digital evangelists insist. It is obvious that everything must be private and everything must be open. And further, it is obvious where and how each of these contradictory principles apply. Langdon Winner, one of our leading philosophers of technology, coined the term cyberlibertarianism in his 1997 article, Cyberlibertarian Myths and the Prospects for Community. The ideas he expressed there were developing elsewhere around the time as well, including in a much-cited essay called The Californian Ideology by media scholars Richard Barbrook and Andy Cameron. Winner describes cyberlibertarianism as, quote, a collection of ideas that links ecstatic enthusiasm for electronically mediated forms of living with radical right-wing libertarian ideas about the proper definition of freedom, social life, economics, and politics. The two prongs of this statement are crucial. On the one hand, an ecstatic enthusiasm for digital technology itself, and on the other, right-wing libertarian ideas about the proper definitions of terms like freedom and others. Winner writes that these views about digital technological progress are too often characterized by a, quote, wholehearted embrace of technological determinism. This is not the generalized determinism of earlier writings on technology and culture, but one specifically tailored to the arrival of electronic technologies. That technological determinism, typically framed as apolitical, insists that, quote, the experiential realm of digital devices and network computing offers endless opportunities for achieving wealth, power, and sensual pleasure. Because inherited structures of social, political, and economic organization pose barriers to the exercise of personal power and self-realization, they simply must be removed. This attitude toward the, quote, inherited structures of social, political, and economic organization, especially the construal of them as barriers, we probably want to quibble about inherited structures of economic organization, which they're actually often quite in favor of. But this attitude strongly shapes cyberlibertarianism as a political force. The kind of language pervades not just the writings of overt right-wing figures like Sam Altman, Paul Graham, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and many others, but also those with nominally left-of-center political leanings like Clay Shirky, Cory Doctorow, and Yochai Benkler. And if anything, these are the writers with whom I'm really concerned in this project. These latter writers frequently take as given right-wing definitions of social freedom, the role of government, and the role of institutions, while occasionally paying what is mostly lip service to the political goals of non-libertarians. In so doing, they play an active role in promulgating the view that digital technology is blowing apart our existing social structures so completely that we have no choice about whether or not to preserve them, and that these explosions are largely, if incoherently, good for democracy. They recommend, and too many follow these recommendations inside and outside of the technology world, that we let technology take the lead and let social institutions like governments catch up and ponder and perhaps adjust to what technology has done only afterwards, if they continue to exist at all. The problem with cyberlibertarianism is most pointed in the way that it pulls many who would declare themselves outright opponents of right-wing politics in general, and political libertarianism specifically, to champion individual rights and economic freedom, advocate for markets as the solution to all social problems, fight government regulation, and to defend, too often without realizing it, the rights of companies like Google to do exactly as they wish, while causes like public education, civil rights, labor conditions, the social safety net, and especially proper regulation of business get either stalled or pushed aside entirely. This is how cyber-libertarianism works, not as much by party politics as by reframing the terms of discourse and the conversation itself so that only variations in rightist political formations ever get on the table, and all concerns are subsumed under a general faith that digital technology is making things better. there's a bit of a gap here. Anti-democratic movements have never been more powerful or influential than in the past few decades. Democracy has never, at least since World War II, been understood to be so close to the brink of collapse, to be replaced by any number of authoritarian, fascist, and dictatorial forms of power. Despite its claims to promote democratization, cyber-libertarian political power is directly implicated in nearly all of these anti-democratic movements, constantly insisting that democratic governance is impossible, but also that computerization is providing real democracy. Of course, any attempt to ground these claims in existing theory about what real democracy is or should be can be dismissed out of hand due to the anti-democratic foundations we start with. Any claim to expertise or knowledge is rejected out of hand as less democratic than the alternative, doing your own research, like all other libertarian tinged slogans means exactly the opposite of what it says. In the era of COVID-19, climate change denial, and the January 6th Stop the Steal insurrection, we have learned brutally just how vital it is for societies to have some mechanisms by which they establish a shared sense of real history and real science and knowledge, what they look like, and how democracy relies on them for its very existence. Digital media tells us that it is vital to that project too. And yet evidence continually shows us the opposite, that the institutions and methods we relied on for democracies to function are specifically what digital media is most effective at destroying. In one sense, cyber-libertarianism, as it is practiced across the political spectrum, can be summarized into a single paradoxical tenet. Mass adoption of ubiquitous computerization directly produces social and political freedom. This adoption is directly tied to economic power. Therefore, only through markets or market-like mechanisms can individuals and societies exercise choice about whether or not to computerize parts of the world, because to exercise choice in other realms would be to impede the progress of freedom. In the name of freedom, this story goes, society has no choice about whether to exercise its power by means other than markets. The greatest tool to produce freedom in our time, then, remarkably requires us to abandon all non-market forms of political power. And just as an example of this sort of taken to the extreme, one of the things that has happened somewhat remarkably in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you've probably heard many stories about cryptocurrency being used on both sides of this conflict, in some cases to support Russia, in some cases to support Ukraine. One of the initial responses that was so remarkable was quite a few cryptocurrency promoters saying this is exactly what cryptocurrency was built for. Governments can't stop us from using it however we want to. We should all say, it's great that we can send money to Russia despite there being sanctions telling us not to do this. And I firmly believe quite a few of these people are very happy to do that. But the specific thing I want to mention is that there were a few pieces that came out in major cryptocurrency publications that said that there is something called the Freedom To Transact. And the Freedom To Transact, which is just pure economic freedom, is not only a vital freedom despite not being mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or anything like that, but it underpins all the other rights. So without the freedom to transact, you can't have the freedom of speech, any other civil rights. Reading sort of economic tinged histories of fascism, that is basically the economic theory, the economic part of classical liberalism that is said to underpin the far-right thought, and certainly it's what all the big libertarians think, right? And it was, it didn't seem an accident that what was happening here was people were directly saying we should be able to keep transacting with a murderous dictator. That's real freedom, and saying it's very seriously. In Philip Murawski's description of neoliberal doctrine, the political right operates through a series of Russian dolls or shells that do not necessarily coordinate with each other and may not even be fully aware of each other. Cyberlibertarianism can be understood as a less explicit outer shell of neoliberalism, or even a number of nested shells. Rather than call themselves cyber-libertarians, its proponents tend to rally around specific evocative terms like free and open, internet freedom, copyright monopolies, and more. Their concerns appear neither nationalistic nor especially populist. Their advocates sometimes embrace a far more progressive social agenda than do political libertarians. Yet on specific and critical matters, the matters about which they are most likely to have significant political impact, the cyber-libertarian doctrine is not merely consistent with, but typically identical with, those points of contact between neoliberalism and libertarianism. Democracy is the problem. Democracy is incompetent and illegitimate. Attempts to ensure equality other than via the invisible hand of the market are automatically the same thing as Soviet-style complete social planning, a theme straight out of Hayek, in 1944. Government must stay out of the way of digital innovation, whether that means enforcing the copyrights of legitimate creators or interfering with the disruptive innovations of the so-called sharing economy startups like Lyft, Airbnb, and Uber, or the massive rewriting of world legal frameworks undertaken by Google. It's worth noting that, if being a little more detailed with Murawski, it's also about the capture of governments, right? To do, there's a lot of anti-government rhetoric, but you actually really capture government and make it write regulations the way you want them. All right, so now I'm going to go to the first of the two examples that I'm going to end with. So central to the development of cyber-libertarianism, in addition to these manifesto documents that I talked about, maybe less remarked in the critical literature, though arguably more important, is the remarkable influence of the so-called cypherpunks and crypto-anarchists, self-described activists who promote strong cryptography as a kind of ineliminable human right, especially via the long-standing cypherpunk mailing list that gives the movement its name. From the crypto, and I should say, because it's become ambiguous, crypto in what I'm the next couple paragraphs refers to cryptography, or the encryption of communications, making them impenetrable to out to surveillance of various sorts. That's used to be what crypto by itself meant, but it has come to mean cryptocurrency, and in a kind of interesting confusion that some of these people themselves have commented on. But anyway. From the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto, which was written in the late 1980s, and its subsequent incarnation as the Cyphernomicon in the early 1990s, which partially takes its name from H.P. Lovecraft, to WikiLeaks, Bitcoin, absolute free speech, anonymity, assassination markets, and many other debates over encryption itself, the cypherpunks have been not just integral, but more often than not at the very center. Timothy May, one of the founders of the email list, is thought by many to have played a major role in the development of Bitcoin, and his writings on the need for untraceable money outside the state can be found even in the earliest versions of the group's manifestos. The list of figures prominent in digital activism from the early 1990s to today is remarkably saturated with members of the cypherpunk mailing list and self-identified crypto-anarchists, and they figure even today as senior personnel in a surprisingly large number of so-called digital rights organizations. And they're mostly, but not entirely, the organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who's comes up for one of the main lines of criticism in this book, who's close to the vest politics, you make it a central cyber-libertarian actor. I can say more about that. The cypherpunks are more than happy if the wide world perceives them as politically neutral, and sometimes do some work to make sure that happens, which they mean in much the same illegible sense that technology is said to be neutral. But one doesn't need to dig deeply to find their putative neutrality is not just tilted toward the far right. To the contrary, the cypherpunks have from the beginning been saturated in far-right philosophy. The Cyphernomicon explicitly identifies that philosophy as a, quote, a form of anarcho-capitalist system, where anarcho-capitalism is the far-right philosophy associated with figures like Murray Rothbard, David Friedman, son of Milton Friedman, who was already farther to the right than Milton, Patry Friedman, who is David's son and even farther to the right, and Hans Hermann Hoppe, all one of the most obvious sites where a version of radical libertarianism bleeds without friction into outright fascism, especially in Hoppe's work. Notably, all of these writings are found with some frequency, and sometimes even the people themselves, especially David Friedman and Patry Friedman, on the cypherpunks mailing list and the associated discussion groups online. Unsurprisingly, the Cyphernomicon devotes much of its space to the same absolutist conception of free speech that we see more and more associated with the far right today. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, the fact that both the tools and the philosophy might help to enable white supremacy was well known even to the cypherpunks in their earliest incarnations. And one section of the Cyphernomicon asks, quote, "Will strong crypto help racists?" May answers without hesitation affirmatively, "Yes, this is a consequence of having secure virtual communities. Free speech tends to work that way!" Exclamation point. And that, quote, "The Aryan nation can use crypto to collect and disseminate information, even into controlled nations like Germany that ban groups like the Aryan nation." So there you can see just the direct, democracy does not apply here, right? We can use these tools to bypass laws that are in place for whatever reason. And one could argue that the German law, which is quite limited in scope in its own way and effectiveness, but outlawing Nazism was a justified and a good thing, that May considers this a positive, can hardly help but be inferred by his final statement that, quote, "Strong crypto will enable and empower groups who have different beliefs than the local majority and will allow them to bypass regional laws," where Nazism is explicitly characterized as different beliefs than the local majority, as if this is a reasonable and common sense description. Later, May writes that many of us are explicitly anti-democratic and hope to use encryption to undermine the so-called democratic governments of the world. In the Manifesto, May writes, "The use of encryption by evil groups, such as child pornographers, terrorists, abortionists, abortion protesters, etc., kind of remarkable, those two, is cited by those who wish to limit civilian access to crypto tools. We call these the four horsemen of the this word gets changed over and over again in the literature, but the Infopocalyps or the Infocalyps. The four horsemen of the Infopocalypse, as they are so often cited as the reason why ordinary citizen units of the nation state are not to have access to crypto, May writes. May asks, how will privacy and anonymity be attacked? And what limits on the net are being proposed? In both cases, one of the responses he notes that they are, like so many other computer hacker terms, they're a tool for the four horsemen, which become, in this case, drug dealers, money launderers, terrorists, and pedophiles. May's clear intent, consistent with his position as a conspiratorial anarcho-capitalist, is to suggest that these tropes will be dishonestly used as a means for the state to deprive ordinary citizen units of the privacy and anonymity that is their natural right. Of course, May feels no obligation to ground these assertions in research or even robust anecdotal observation, and the full import of his assertion is not entirely stated outright. The import is clear, though. When authorities or critics mention one of the four horsemen of the Infopocalypse, they are obviously lying, and lying because they want to deprive you of your rights. All claims about them are a priori false. It is not remotely surprising, so that was all in the late 80s, early 90s, but it's not remotely surprising that the four horsemen trope occurs repeatedly in technology promotion about encryption and anonymization technology, even much more recently, often with the presumption that the existence of the trope proves that the concerns it mentions are absurd, and even among those who do not, like May, identify with the political right. So Cory Doctorow, a science fiction author and one of the most troubling actors in this space to me, in a response to a statement by outgoing Attorney General Eric Holder and the FBI in 2014 that it needed some kind of legal warranted access to an encrypted system out of a concern about a terrorist threat, Doctorow writes, "The arguments then are the arguments now. Governments invoke the four horsemen of the Infopocalypse, software pirates, organized crime, child pornographers, and terrorists, and say that unless they can decrypt bad guys' hard drives and listen in on their conversations, law and order is a dead letter." And that's the entirety of the argument he provides for why this is false. By labeling these concerns, notably not the same ones May uses, as the four horsemen, Doctorow writes as if he has demonstrated that they are not real. Thus, the trope provides encryptionists with a rhetorical tool that makes it unnecessary to engage with the actual facts and arguments being offered, and perhaps even more perniciously, it gives weight to the conspiratorial view that democratic governments continuously lie in order to justify expansive powers that they want for reasons other than those they indicate. put aside software piracy, a phenomenon that is largely something that only exists in the network digital age, and therefore is without question a real thing, whatever its extent might be, look at some of the other major candidate four horsemen: money laundering, drug dealing, and child pornography. In each case, advocates and experts who work in these spheres, especially drug dealing and child pornography, report dramatic increases since the advent of digital technology, especially in the case of child abuse imagery, largely fueled by anonymized and encrypted digital technology. To take only the most child protection advocates continue to see explosions in the creation and distribution of child sexual exploitation materials online, almost always associated with the so-called dark web, that is the Tor hidden services network, and with encrypted messaging apps like WhatsApp that EFF and others argue should be made entirely impenetrable to law enforcement. One searches in vain for serious acknowledgement from digital rights advocates that this is a real problem, let alone that it is a problem that follows naturally from the technology itself and from the way they advocate for it. To the contrary, it is standard for digital evangelists to proclaim themselves the real experts on child abuse and to dismiss the work of advocates and advocacy organizations. And there are some hearings before Congress that you simply would not believe if you saw them, in which some very well-known people who get money from Google and Facebook and other organizations like that sit, before senators with a straight face and say, these representatives of child trafficking organizations that have been around for 30 years are actually plants for the copyright lobby, and the senators just are like, what? And nevertheless, they have some success in these in this effort. Even worse, because the cypherpunks have developed an entirely novel and contradictory political theory according to which the most fundamental human right is absolute opacity to government oversight. They're able to spin any concern about absolutely awful harms done to ordinary persons as inconsequential compared to the harms that would be done if governments were allowed to enforce laws. This leads ideologues like Doctorow to make grandiose and entirely counterfactual statements like, quote, "The police have never had the power to listen in on every conversation, to spy upon every interaction. Power that, properly warranted, governments have literally had with regard to every form of communication, especially electronic communications, including telephony, since they went into wide use." Perhaps even worse, it allows them to turn authoritative and very worrying factual statements against themselves. When Andrew Luhmann stepped down as the executive director of the Tor organization, and Tor is the software that allows you to run the dark web, or that allows you to access the dark web, he stated that part of the reason for his resignation was, quote, 95% of what we see on The Onion and other dark net sites is just criminal activity. It varies in severity from copyright piracy to drug markets to horrendous trafficking of humans and exploitation of women and children. That is the Four Horsemen again. Clearly, Luhmann was in a position, arguably a unique position, to know what he was talking about. Nevertheless, armed with the Four Horsemen trope, digital rights promoters attacked Luhmann, claiming that he was the one threatening to harm human rights by daring to point out what is obvious to at least some of us on the outside, and to some extent what must have always been obvious to May and other cypherpunks, that the main usage for these tools, especially if they are put entirely beyond democratic oversight, is to enable the worst kinds of antisocial behavior and antisocial actors in our world, not just to be one more avenue they use, but a prime and explosive promoter of these activities. Although it is rarely done, it is hard not to connect the dots and suggest that for at least some of those promoting these tools as fundamental to human rights, they very much intend to use them for just the purposes mentioned in the Four Horsemen trope, and that they are able to use this trope to forestall any serious investigation or oversight of these activities by the authorities we think we entrust to prevent and prosecute them. This is the last little section, which is chopped out of a much longer section on freedom of speech. So in a 2014 document that seems quite bizarre a decade later, EFF chastised Twitter for complying with court orders to take down content in countries where they do not have significant assets or employees. Twitter, EFF claimed, was, quote, stepping down from the free speech party. EFF's legal reasoning is quite strange, but its consequences are even stranger. Twitter, in EFF's opinion, must display any content its users choose to post, everywhere, regardless of government policies. As the legal scholar Marianne Franks notes, while a general orientation toward less rather than more interference with user speech may be a welcome principle in content moderation, platforms are under no obligation whatsoever to allow any specific person to use or not to use their product. This inversion of democratic principle, under which we now learn that that the Constitution says that only digital platforms that allow unmoderated speech are legal, is so absurd as to be rarely said out loud, and yet it remains the default conceptual argument that digital rights organizations claim to stand by. Perhaps an even more critical aspect of the free speech framing is that it subtly takes off the table what should be a fundamental question. Who decides whether social media platforms like Twitter are in the first place legitimate businesses to operate and/or legal technologies that can operate without a license? Many forms of communications technology are highly regulated by democratic governments, and in fact, those with the most reach, such as television and radio, have often been most subject to regulation and licensing. And here, given the tremendous power of social media, it is by no means clear that it fits into any strong sense of a democratic polity, especially without regulation or licensing. First Amendment jurisprudence in the US, despite what advocates frequently say, and despite being the closest to absolute free speech protection in the world, is not in fact absolute. Its parameters include not just exceptions for private spaces, as Franks and others have noted, although in general what we call public spaces are required to allow any legal speech across the board. Governments are permitted to, and frequently do, impose what are called content-neutral, time and place restrictions on speech, even in public forums. This is so central to First Amendment jurisprudence in the US that the general principle is even now considered to be solid and generally untouchable law. And I'm just going to fill in a little bit here. The argument that Twitter and Facebook make is that they have the right to set up public spaces that cannot be governed. Right? And this is unlike any other public spaces that governments can normally set up, which are typically very specific places, right? They actually have to be geographic locations. Government and the people and everybody have the choice to whether the space will be private or public. Government can still say certain spaces no speech is allowed. Right? These are all completely legitimate activities, even in the absolutist US. The corporate argument and the argument of some technology promoters to some extent is that this is not a power that government should have. Right? It just should be up to people to be able to go and decide whether or not we're going to set up a completely regulation-free space. And I should say that it's part of I'm not going to get to read any of it, but it's part of the argument of this book is that we should be considering a kind of abolitionist argument about this material, that in fact some of these technologies and the companies that run them are just unacceptable, right? And maybe they could be licensed. That's Frank Pasquale's idea that I mentioned a bit. But I think unless they're properly licensed and unless there's some sort of do no harm principle that they can show they're actually okay in some interesting way, they probably need to go away. And I think Tony or somebody mentioned the book Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff earlier, and this is really her position also, that in fact, her position is even stronger, not just that they shouldn't be allowed, but that in fact the kinds of activities that they conduct should be criminalized. And I think I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it's a really interesting idea. I could get into what she means exactly, but and part of my point is this is what cyberlibertarianism does, is it keeps off the table the question of whether these platforms are legitimate to begin with. And that should be a very open question that we should be talking about a lot. And thankfully, people like Zuboff are. So it is no accident that agitation over free speech and censorship online has the effect of keeping off the table entirely the basic question of the legitimacy and legality of purportedly public speech forums, whatever their negative effects might be, and no matter how fully these are documented. The free speech argument for digital technology is a kind of fundamental backstop that makes it nearly impossible for democracies to consider what should be the central question: to what extent do democratic polities need to allow technologies to proliferate, part of whose function is to make democratic sovereignty difficult or even impossible? It is no accident that the most vociferous advocates for free speech online, like EFF and even the technology arm of the ACLU, generally refuse to reflect on recent US Supreme Court doctrine that increasingly equates money and corporate action with speech. Indeed, most famously in the Citizens United decision, ACLU has sided with corporations in this regard, raising profound questions for many longtime ACLU supporters as to the organization's own commitment to democratic values. For decades, First Amendment scholars, especially Daniel Greenwood, have noted the expansion of free speech jurisprudence in the U.S. Greenwood notes that the First Amendment principle of abstention, that is, abstention from being able to make law, has expanded beyond a program of making politics safe, so as to become a primary vehicle in a post-New Deal attempt to reduce the scope of conscious collective control over the market. The First Amendment, understood in this way as a fundamental limitation on the scope of government, has become the locus of a new Lochnerism, or rather a revival of the old Lochnerism under a new doctrinal label. Precisely what is at issue in the idea of Lochnerism is using free speech as a way of describing economic activity, and then using that description as a way to prevent regulation of everything. This goes far beyond the famed money is speech doctrine that many feel the Supreme Court made into law in Citizens United by entirely blurring the line between speech and action. But that distinction is fundamental to free speech law. It is only by dint of being describable as speech that something gains First Amendment protections, which seriously restrict the way democratic governments can regulate it. Despite the fact that in a philosophical sense, the line between speech and action can be hard to fully formalize in a satisfactory way, it is only because they can be distinguished in a rough sense that free speech doctrine exists at all. After all, if speech was action and all action was speech, democratic governance would be strictly impossible. Making it so is precisely the most fundamental commitment of cyberlibertarianism. Thank you. Sorry, that was very rough.
I was hoping you were going to say April Fool at the end. Because we're the ones that are fooled. I suppose this will be in the bigger book, but maybe you could link this very dark and disturbing, but accurate description with how it affects things that you support that might seem related but are fundamentally different, such as paywalls, which affect us, Boundary 2, and to some degree, not the same, but a copyleft or freer exchange of information, not always related to paywalls. Because it would seem like it could be used in a way to undermine those more legitimate, and it actually relates to Tony's argument about equality versus freedom, because those are issues of equality, of access, but they could be tainted maybe. Anyway, this is something you write about otherwise, so I just wonder what the connection is.
Yeah, I have a long section on copyright, and I deliberately did not give it today because it gets me in trouble. I have a lot of feelings about copyright, and I mean, let's put it, first of all, there is a coordinated attack on copyright in the world, right? And Google is the main architect of it, and Facebook is very close behind, and they would like there to be very little. Spotify is, one of its current chief architects. Spotify profits enormously from making sure musicians get nothing for their music, right? But Spotify gets enormous amounts of money. So I am skeptical of the whole anti-copyright movement. I mean, that is because I'm unclear about its real motivations. I'm unclear about, to ask Paul's favorite question, cui bono. I will also note that in the, in general, I don't want to say too much more about this, but the idea of academic journals making their material available to people for free is appealing to me, but partially because of the historical nature of academic journals, and they are kind of the area where I worry about it the least. But even there, it is fascinating, right? Boundary, the B2O online project, which Paul and Arnie and I have, spent a lot of time working on, all of its stuff is completely free, right? Absolutely free of any charge. It's been that way from the beginning, but it is not open access. And that is because of this distinction between the open access people who have who have societies and symposia and everything. They actually have very rigid requirements that are often really disturbing, right? And one of the things that we do is we say, we post something by you, you own the copyright. We would like you to say it first appeared here, but it's yours. That is unacceptable to open access. To the open access people, you must give away the They will say it's not giving away the copyright. I will say it is giving away the copyright. I think I will stop there because I will get myself into trouble.
David, that was a wonderful talk. I'm looking forward to the book. I have a question about a term that didn't appear, I think, in your talk, but I was thinking about, and I know you've thought a lot about, and that's decentralism, right? Decentralized, right? That it seems time to reevaluate something like Alex Galloway's thesis, right? That decentralism or decentralization is about the protocol, right? That's the site.
How control exists after decentralization.
Right, the site of that. And it seems to me a better way of describing decentralization now is the shell game that you're talking about in some ways, right? Of using decentralization, using openness combined with cryptography to produce an alternate network of relations that turns out to be maybe something like the global right wing that we were hearing about earlier today. So I'd just like to invite you to maybe talk with us a little bit about that. I'm also thinking about recent discussions about these decentralized, autonomous, right, organizations that are linked to, of course, Bitcoin, and they seem to be shell games themselves, right, to hide actual centralization that's taking place by the organizations minting, right, coins or whatever.
Or
to give
NFTs, as Arnie's written about.
Yeah, to give the impression, right, that one owns something or that one has a vote in something, but they do not. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks for that question. The decentralization section in this book comes right after the democratization section, and they are very closely tied, although they are also different in the sense that centralization and decentralization are just metaphors, right? I mean, they are literal descriptions of how physical networks can be put together, absolutely. But as soon as you go any further than that, you're saying, okay, well, this political organization is kind of like this network over here, and I'm going to say it's decentralized. And you could. I wrote a piece a long time ago that were like centralization and decentralization just go hand in hand, and like you can look at the same object from one angle and be like, that's completely centralized, and look at it from another angle and be it's completely decentralized. I'll give an example: Bitcoin, right? Which is Bitcoin has a white paper that describes a completely dispersed egalitarian network in which there are billions of people running their own computers, minting these little coins, right? So it sounds decentralized. But in fact, because it has no protections, it's a truly free market. And what happened was it became immediately swamped by the most powerful players in the world. And so in fact, something like 10 or 30 or 40 entities control 50 or 60% of all the mining, and 60 or 70% of all the economic transactions that happen. So in fact, it is much more heavily centralized than the regular financial system. So yes, from one angle, we argue about this all the time, right? The CoinDesk and Bitcoinist magazine have pieces every day about, it's the decentralized network that's going to fix everything, and so from that angle, it's decentralized, but from another angle, it's completely centralized. I guess I'll say one other thing, which is these words have really long and interesting histories, right? There was a kind of left decentralization. Winner writes about this in his book, The Whale and the Reactor, which seemed to be something more along the lines of devolved, localized government, which, I'm like, that sounds great. If you're saying more local, more school boards and things, I mean, I guess that sounds at least plausible, and I don't have a problem with it. It's like a democratic form. But Hayek talks about decentralization, and then it is anti-government, right? It's just, there should be no government here. And Lindsay?
David, I'm just going to ask you a dumb question. Can you describe the progress of your thinking because from the dissertation to the book to the three books. So, just in real, 2 sentences or 5 sentences or three sentences.
No.
But can you, in some way, epitomize your progress?
I mean, I will say from the book you so graciously published of mine, where I was much more concerned with sort of the psychological formations of why people who love power are so attracted to computers, and why there is a kind of a tendency in people who identify with computers to also have a kind of right-wing belief set. And part of what I wrote in there was, when you look at institutions and you look at disciplines that have fractures along lines of computers, right? You have one group of scholars who say, let's computerize, and another group of scholars who say, let's not. Let's computerize this discipline. In general, it's the people who are saying let's computerize who are also have a lot of other, where the right tends to coalesce and where the left people in the departments tend to go, tends to be let's be more cautious about it. That was a really odd thing that I noticed. I guess my thinking is, if anything, it's just gone a lot more toward the nuances of political formations and the fragility of democracy, and the fact that I don't see very much outside of democracy that is a plausible way of distributing sovereignty or, promoting egalitarianism. I thought what Tony said in his talk was exactly sort of where I have been heading myself, that like some promotion of equality in some radical foundational sense is like, I think it's even in Marx, if you're reading Marx in the way that that the C.L.R. James did, and Grace Lee Boggs and the Marxist humanist people and so forth. I think, to me, that is they're seeing a liberatory impulse in Marx that has to, some respect for individual equality has to be there. I'll stop there.
Whether I'm the center or the decenter. I'm sorry, we don't have time. Can we take 10 minutes and then we'll come back for our last paper, and thank David very much.